I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. We are going to be talking about new UFC signees on this week's episode. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me is Patrick Wyman. And Pat, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Really looking forward to talking about these guys. I've had my eye on both of them for a long time now, going back to about 2013.
Yeah. So let's mention first who we have on the docket today. Justin Gaethje from World Series of Fighting was very recently picked up by the UFC. He is now scheduled to face Michael Johnson in his UFC debut. Marlon Moraes from World Series of Fighting has also been picked up. I don't know if we have a matchup for him yet, but
we do. He's fighting Rafael Sunsao actually very soon at UFC 212.
That is
June 3rd.
Amazingly good fight. Holy shit. So that's amazing. That's very exciting. Moraes, of course, trains with Mark Henry and the crew over in New Jersey, and is, like, along with Edson Barboza, who also trains there, a very dangerous kicker who has developed a really good boxing game. So that is going to be exciting as well. We have, my God, I keep forgetting Magomedsharipov's first name.
Zabit.
It's a difficult name, damn it. Zabit Magomedsharipov has also been...
Zabit.
Zabit. Okay.
Z-A-B-I-T.
Pat, you have to kill me now. I just cannot do these names. I swear to God.
Planning on it already.
And then we have Peter Yan, two interesting fighters from Eastern Europe that will also be making their debuts. But let's go ahead and talk about the one that I think the most people are going to be the most excited about seeing right away. It's Justin Gaethje, who has a reputation as a maniac who just has been in nothing but wars as the World Series of Fighting lightweight champion. Now, that, of course, is not necessarily a good thing for him long-term, but he has been an extremely exciting fighter, and I think a lot of people have been hoping for him to come to the UFC for several years now. He's finally here. What do you think of him overall as a fighter? Like, what's the thing that people should know about Justin Gaethje?
He is a brawler, and I mean that in the best way possible. He's insane. He fights like a crazy person, but that doesn't mean that he lacks technique. He just knows who and what he is, and he fights accordingly.
Yeah.
He's a dude who likes to be in there blasting you with punches. He likes to be at close range. He's an infighter. He was a wrestler. He wrestled at Northern Colorado. He doesn't really use his takedowns much, but he can fall back on that when he needs to. He has made real improvements as a technical fighter in the last few years. Like, he used to just kind of love to brawl, but he's gotten demonstrably better. He trains under Trevor Whitman at Grudge. So he's a well-trained fighter. He's got a real good coach and one who does a good job of teaching exactly the skills that Gaethje likes to use.
Yeah. And he's still not a great defensive fighter. He's a
terrible defensive fighter.
We should be clear about that.
He's terrible.
He's one of the worst. At the elite level, he probably has the worst defensive skill. But you know, like, I think the thing we have to understand about Justin Gaethje is that success for him is not necessarily defined by the same metrics as it is for others. That if you were to go and teach Justin Gaethje and focus entirely on defense, you might end up with like the strategic equivalent of like K1 Maya. You know what I mean? Like, when Damian Maya was out there, he had focused a bunch on learning to strike, and he was out there kickboxing with everyone. It was a bad idea. Like, you should never...
I mean, it's not like he was bad at it. Like, he was competitive on the feet with Chris Weidman.
But he should never... he was quite competitive, actually. But he should never have treated his amazing grappling like a backup plan. And I think if you were to put a ton of focus on, like, not taking damage for Justin Gaethje, you would take the fact that he is amazingly tough, that he can take a hell of a shot, that he does not back down under fire, and that he's extremely powerful, and that he likes to brawl. Like, not that he does it out of discomfort, like a lot of people do. He likes it. Like, he actually likes a firefight. You would make those things a backup plan.
He's Lineker-esque in that regard, that like brawling, he is the rare born brawler.
Yeah.
As opposed to like some brawlers get made, like Stefan Struve is a guy who was a made brawler back in the day. There are other fighters who, because of the environment that they're brought up in, they just learn to thrive in a firefight.
Yeah.
That's kind of the environment that molds them. Gaethje was made that way. Gaethje was born that way. He was born wanting to get in your face and just blast you with punches. Because, when he hits guys, they go flying like something out of a 60s Batman episode.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous how hard he can hit guys. So he has built his game around doing that effectively. And because he's got a great gas tank, because he can fight deep into the fight, working at a pretty absurd pace, he both wears you down. He has the kind of power that both wears you down and can finish you with a single shot. Yeah. So, and his game is built around that. And, not really being afraid to take a shot when he needs to. When he doesn't need to take a shot.
Yeah. But for him, that what means, what doesn't need to take it mean? It's different for him than it would be for most other fighters. That I think Trevor Whitman's done a pretty good job with slowly trying to make him a better fighter. Now again, Justin Gaethje is not. I would be very surprised if he had a really long career. You know what I mean? He takes a ton of damage, but he dishes out even more in just about every fight, and that is the important thing about the way he fights right now. He does some neat things. He's not just a reckless brawler, in the sense that he's not just throwing punches with no thought whatsoever. He has some cool tricks. One of them that we've talked about before is the way that he's a vicious low kicker. But we've talked about his low kicks in the clinch. Not something that you see used a lot in MMA. Gaethje makes it look like a tool that everyone should have in their arsenal, where he will tie up in sort of a tie clinch. Doesn't particularly matter what position he has as long as he's breaking your posture. And sort of dragging your weight over your front foot so you can't lift it. He will then, while holding onto your head, turn his hips over surprisingly quickly and smash you in the side of the leg with a leg breaking right low kick. And he does that a lot. He has done some serious damage to opponents with that technique. Another thing he does in the clinch that I think that doesn't get enough credit, he's not an amazing takedown artist, but I think the transitions between striking and wrestling are actually quite good. Not just with grabbing the head and throwing low kicks. I recall an example from Gaethje's fight with his second fight with Luis Palomino. No, maybe it was his first fight. Both of those are amazing fights, by the way. They're on YouTube. So if you have not seen, by some strange twist of fate, if you have not seen Gaethje Palomino 1 or 2, you need to watch them both. But he had Palomino in a collar tie. Like a collar and elbow type of position. He went for a knee tap, and Palomino adjusted. He pulled his leg back, and Gaethje immediately popped up with his collar tie still in place and yanked Palomino's head down into an uppercut, which dropped him. And then he jumps on Palomino, hits him with punches from a sort of leg ride or a crotch pry ride position from Palomino's back. Palomino tries to stand up. Gaethje waits for him to start to stand up, and as he does, follows his momentum and lifts him off his feet and slams him to the ground. Everything flows together surprisingly smoothly for a guy whose reputation is that of a maniac and nothing more.
He's a smart tactical fighter, and the way that his tactics kind of string together makes him a better strategic fighter than he has any right to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
I don't think any of us are going to sit here and say we think Gaethje is going to win a title, or that we think even that Gaethje is necessarily going to beat elite fighters in the UFC. Though I think he can. I think that there's going to be a tendency to look at him and say he's kind of a dumb brawler. And I'm not going to say that you're totally wrong about that, but I think that he has a way of sucking guys into his kind of fight that borders on brilliance. That you can go in there and want to have a real slick technical outside striking matchup with him, but trying to maintain that against a guy who's going to come after you and who it hurts when he hits you. It hurts in a way that I think it rarely does for experienced fighters who are used to being in tough sparring sessions and tough fights. It feels different when Gaethje touches you, and he has a way of inducing panic Maybe not in the first round, maybe not in the second round, but if you get to the third round and Gaethje has kicked your legs 15 or 20 times, even if you've punched him in the face 15 or 20 times before then, like, you are going to feel it. He is going to make you feel it.
Yeah,
and
he really does. Like, he will lift people off their feet with uppercuts and knees. He will rip people's legs out from under them with one kick. Like, he really does have some amazing power.
Yeah, he's I think that as his game develops, he's going to be better served to pressure more and try to kickbox in the center of the cage less, because that seems to be something that for whatever reason he likes to do. Like, I think he thinks he's better at it than he is.
Yeah.
But for him to have a sustainable game at a high level for Gaethje is going to look like him walking his opponents down, pushing them into the cage, and looking to do more of the kind of transitional stuff that you talked about. Mm-hmm. And I think he's capable of it. And I think that he can do that without losing the essential pieces that make him effective. So he's set to debut against Michael Johnson, and I would expect to see him doing more of that in this fight. I actually expect him to beat Johnson because, like, on paper, tough matchup for Gaethje. A stick and move outside striker who's real quick, who throws in combination, who has power in his hands, who can wrestle pretty well, who isn't going to be afraid to tie up with him. I see all of that. But the flip side to it is Johnson has always been a guy that you can suck into his opponent's fight. Mm-hmm. Always. Like, that is Johnson's great weakness, is that it's hard for him to stick to a game plan for an especially long time in the face of pressure and in the face of somebody who's trying to get him to do something different. And I think that Gaethje excels at doing exactly that.
That is a very interesting point, because I was going to bring up this matchup. I think it's worth our time to discuss it a little bit. That Michael Johnson, Phil McKenzie suggested that like for Will Brooks, for example, this is a problem that a lot of guys from other promotions have. When Will Brooks came to the UFC, he was simply, in a specific way, not prepared for the difference between his average UFC opponent and his average Bellator opponent. That most of them were bigger and stronger for their weight, and most of them were closer to him in terms of athleticism. Like, even the ones who aren't as good, like Charles Oliveira, very good athlete, and somehow still, like, looked substantially bigger than Will Brooks, despite the fact that he has been fighting as a featherweight. And that is not something that Will Brooks encountered in Bellator. There is not as much pressure, I think, on the regional circuit for fighters to cut as much weight as possible. And I think that we see a lot of guys drop divisions in the UFC as a result. They realize, oh shit, like, now that I'm here, I need to adjust. I need to be bigger than these people because everyone's bigger than me. So that was the problem for Will Brooks. I think Phil suggested that the problem for Gaethje would be like speed and dynamism, which is not something he's really faced at all in World Series of Fighting. Like, really, the fastest guy he's fought is like a 300-year-old Melvin Gillard. You know what I mean? He has not faced somebody like Michael Johnson, like, with that amount of speed and that amount of pop and quickness and agility. They have been people who have, I think, been easier to suck into his fight because of the fact that they can't get away from him very well. So I wonder if the point about Johnson having a specific foible of being drawn into people's fights, that is a very, very good point. But I do wonder how much the speed of Johnson alone will play a factor, like how much the athletic ability, because it is not something that Gaethje has seen in his fights before.
See, Johnson, I'm with you. I understand exactly where you're coming from on that. But I'll say the flip side to it is that Johnson has not always been able to impose his speed advantage even against less athletically gifted opposition.
Yeah.
That has not, that as fast as he is as an effect and as effective as that has been for him, the only fight that I can really think of where you look at it and you're like, holy shit, okay, that's why he's winning this fight. That's why he's won this fight. I would say the Tebow fight back in, that was 2013. The Lozon fight back in 2013, like against Nate Diaz, who took the second and the third rounds from Johnson, just kind of by peppering him over and over and over again, and by being relentless with the kind of approach that he had, like that. I mean, Johnson was way faster by any metric. Johnson was way faster in that fight. Yeah. Against Beneil Dariush, again, a fight that Johnson probably won. Like, he probably got robbed a little bit on that decision there, but Dariush never, despite being at a substantial speed advantage, never looked like he was fazed by it. Yeah. And I kind of think that Gaethje too, it's going to take him some time to adjust, but I think that Gaethje too is going to be able to time it and figure it out and eventually get him where he needs to be.
Yeah, the difference is that in order to do that, Gaethje is going to have to get hit a bunch. Whereas like Nate Diaz and Beneil Dariush, we both agree, I'm sure, are substantially better boxers than Justin Gaethje. Like they are both technically fundamentally better and harder to hit. Like Justin Gaethje willingly gets hit a lot of the time.
Yeah, to the head, but Diaz got eaten up to the legs and body in that fight. He ate a lot of shots.
Yeah, and it was the fact that Johnson couldn't avoid playing Diaz's game that he ended the fight boxing with him more than kickboxing. So yeah, that is definitely. Yeah, but we know Gaethje can be hurt too. Like he's tough as shit, but he has been dropped a few times. Is Johnson powerful enough? I don't know, man. It's gonna be. The thing is that if you watch a Justin Gaethje fight, there is very little chance that it will not be fun. Mm-hmm. Like, and in the way that fights are fun because they're back and forth. Like every Gaethje fight is back and forth, which isn't, again, not great for him in the long term, but it is extremely entertaining to watch. So yeah, Gaethje versus Johnson should deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist in the long run about Gaethje because he's still pretty young. Even though he's taking quite a bit of damage, he is learning. He's getting better from fight to fight. And I think that to some extent, I think that a switch might flip with him when he realizes how much better the guys he's fighting are, that he can't just do the same stuff over and over again and expect different results. Mm-hmm. Like, so if he does take an L against Michael Johnson, I actually think Johnson should be the favorite in this fight. I think he should probably come in somewhere between -160 and -200. Like, I think that if Gaethje loses this fight, then Gaethje is capable of making adjustments, which may not necessarily be the case for the guy that we'll talk about shortly here in Marlon Moraes. Mm-hmm. I think Moraes is basically a finished product in a way that I don't believe Gaethje is.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited to see it, man. Hey, he already has turned the corner because Justin Gaethje has a Wikipedia page. Which finally
he has a Wikipedia.
A pretty long one too. It's actually pretty well drawn out. It's got a lot of words on it. And I don't know if anyone's in on this joke, but for years Justin Gaethje has been putting on exciting performances. Been one of the more important athletes not in the UFC in the sport of MMA, and has not had a Wikipedia page. So good for him. It's now easy to reference and find out all of the necessaries on Justin Gaethje. But let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about our next guy that Pat just sort of presaged, Marlon Moraes, World Series of Fighting, another fighter from World Series of Fighting. He was their bantamweight champion and has pretty clearly been the best bantamweight outside the UFC for the last several years. So we will talk about that guy after this break. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back to talk about, I was just thinking about this, Pat. I can't keep up with your very lovely Brazilian Portuguese pronunciations, and you always get me doing it, right? Like now, whenever I'm talking to you, I'm like, chute box, chute box. I'm like Marlon Moraes. I'm like rolling, like dancing off the R there. I have an uneducated American tongue. I'm just going to say Marlon Moraes. I'll let you be the pretty pronouncer of the name. But
Marlon Moraes?
Marlon Moraes is making his UFC debut. And that's what is important here. It's not how we say his name. I'm sorry, Marlon. It's more important that you're going to be in the UFC. And he's awesome. I might be a little more excited for Justin Gaethje just because I know what a Justin Gaethje fight means, whereas Moraes has been dominating people mostly in World Series of Fighting. But he is a fantastic fighter, and I think like fellow Brazilian-American Edson Barboza and teammate Edson Barboza has found a really good team for his style. Like I think he has blossomed really well and sort of, I mean, he's settled into his game, but he's been doing for some time now, I think, what Edson Barboza was kind of struggling towards at the start of his UFC career.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Moraes is a bit of a late bloomer, you might say. Because he looked like a pretty undistinguished fighter for the first few years of his career. Like when he got into World Series of Fighting, he was 7-4-1. Like he did not look especially imposing at that point.
Yeah.
But since he got into World Series of Fighting, he won, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think he won 11 fights in World Series of Fighting, 11 fights in a row. Most of them finishes, most of them impressive. Like the dude has really blossomed into an elite bantamweight. And
yeah.
I mean, I rate him as, I'd say like top 6 on skills. I mean, the level of competition is a concern, but on skills alone, I don't think there's any reason to think that he's not an elite guy.
Yeah, and I think fighting like sub top 25 bantamweights is probably better than fighting like sub top 25 heavyweights, for example. Like it's a deep enough division that even without it being necessarily UFC talent, he's been defending his WSOF belt against, he has been fighting fairly decent fighters and destroying them. Yeah, and he has been. It is important to note that he has been dominating them. Like if you say that, if you're really good, you should dominate this level of opposition. He has. He has had no difficulty.
Yeah, and I mean, and they're not bad fighters. Like that's a thing to bear in mind here. Is these aren't like scrubs. They may not be the elite, the cream of the division, but they're known guys. I mean, like Cody Bollinger is a guy who's been around a long time. He's a veteran. He competed on The Ultimate Fighter. Gentleman Josh Hill, who was like an elite prospect a few years back that never really turned the corner. Shimon Moraes, another former elite prospect, a guy that I actually like a lot. I think he's a good fighter. Jose Aldo Silva, a journeyman who's been around a long time. Like these are good guys that he's beaten. Now, there's always going to be a question about how is that going to translate, but I don't think there's any reason to think that he's not going to be competitive with the elite in the UFC. For how long is my real question? Because he's 28, he's been fighting for 10 years. Like I think that
29.
I'm sorry,
29. I think.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Turned 29 in April.
Yeah, so just turned 29. Like this is a dude who is he is a finished product. You're not going to see a lot more from him than what you've already seen, and there's a real chance of a drop-off. So of all of the guys that the UFC signed in this regard, like Gaethje has like 6 years of pro experience. He's like, I think he's 28. Like the guys that we'll talk about next is Zabit Magomedsharipov, who just got signed. Like Magomedsharipov is a pup. Like that dude is a prospect.
Yeah.
Moraes is not a prospect. You are signing a guy so that you think he can compete right away.
Yeah. You think he can be at the very worst a high level gatekeeper for a couple of years, and you're expecting him to be a contender. I will say that kind of opposite to Gaethje, Moraes may not. I think there might be a better chance that Gaethje drops off sooner than Moraes if Gaethje cannot make the right adjustments and the wear and tear starts affecting him. Because you can say what you will about Marlon Moraes as a fighter, but he doesn't take a lot of damage. He hasn't been taking much damage at all for the last 4 years. He has been cleaning out his division in World Series of Fighting, whereas Gaethje has been soaking up punishment as if he loves it. I mean, he has been a quite masochistic fighter for all of his career. So there's a little more evidence to me to say that Moraes probably has 2 or 3 more years at least of top form in him. But it's hard to say. Who knows? Oh
yeah,
go on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I think that Moraes is. I'm inclined to believe what my eyes have shown me with Moraes, that he is a guy who's going to be elite for at least a little while. Like, I don't think he beats Garbrandt. I don't think he beats Dillashaw, but I think he's got a good chance of beating everybody else. Yeah. And I think that he would be real competitive with Dillashaw and Garbrandt. That's how good I think Moraes is. But yeah, I think the difference here is whether you consider these guys long-term investments or short-term investments. Like when the UFC signed Will Brooks, even though he's lost 2 in a row, Will Brooks is a long-term investment. You're thinking about what can this guy do for me 2-3 years down the road when he's kind of in his late prime. With Magomedsharipov, you're like, this guy may not be as good as he could possibly get for another 4 years. You've got a long time to do this. With Moraes, it's very much what is he capable of doing for me right now and in the next 3-4 fights.
Yeah, because he has spent the last several years cementing his style, finding himself and basically, becoming his final form. How would you describe that final form? What are the things people need to know about Marlon Moraes? What are the things they need to look for when they watch him fight?
Real crisp, real technically sound striking. a good boxer, a pretty dang good boxer, with outstanding footwork, takes really clean angles, moves well with his shots, knows when to plant, knows when to keep his feet moving under him. A crushing low kicker, absolutely crushing low kicker, Barboza-esque, which makes sense because they've been friends and training partners since they were I think they were 8 or 9 years old when they started training together, and they had the same coach for a long time before they both moved to the U.S. So similarities in that regard. He's very physically gifted. He's not like a Barboza-esque athlete, but he's an extremely good athlete. He reminds me of kind of a cross between Frankie Edgar and Edson Barboza. I think he boxes a lot like Edgar does. I think he kicks with some similarities to Barboza. He'll mix in some spinning stuff from time to time, but just rock solid everywhere. Good takedown defense. He's a surprisingly sharp grappler, especially in transitions when he gets the chance. He's real good if he can drop you. He's got great instincts for spinning around to the back or finding a submission. Lot to like about that.
Yeah, I think the one thing that has always stood out to me the most about Moraes is how good he is as a counter kicker, which we talked last week about how impressive it was that Ioane and Jacek was landing head kicks while retreating against Jessica Andrade. Moraes does that stuff very well. He will slide out of range, and as he's moving backwards, like with 1 foot off the ground, taking a little hop step, he will throw a kick and pack some good power in it. Like, he still maintains his power even when he's kicking in what should be a sort of mechanically compromised position. And then when he is sort of controlling the pace and coming forward, is very much like a Dutch-style kickboxer, but not so tied to that he will like willingly go toe-to-toe with someone. You know, he's a smart tactical fighter. It's very difficult to suck, I think it's difficult to suck Marlon Moraes into a game that really makes no sense for him. If you know what I mean, like into a pace or a style of fighting that doesn't work. And I think the evidence for that is that even though we've seen Moraes, we have seen him finish a lot of guys lately, and I think get better at finishing people over time in World Series of Fighting. We also know he can go the 5-round distance, and we know that he can very clearly take 5 rounds against a fairly solid opponent. So I think that speaks to his, not just his conditioning, but his composure, that while being a dangerous guy who can finish you, if he needs to be a little more careful, a little more strategic with how he approaches the fight, then he can. I think that we have enough evidence to say that he probably can. What do you think of him versus Rafael Assunção? Because Rafael Assunção is my boy. But
yeah, well, I think we're going to talk about. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about this before UFC 212 too. But to give the quick outlines of it, I think this is exactly the right matchup to give him, because at this point, the UFC seems fairly convinced that Assunção is not going to be their guy to make a run at the title. I agree with that. I think that's probably correct.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's a guy who does absolutely everything well. He wrestles well. He strikes well. He's got power in his hands. He's fast. Like, he is a good simulacrum of the kinds of challenges that you're going to face at the top of this division.
He's a perfect gatekeeper for elite contenders. Like, if you want a shot at the title, I think it makes sense to go through Rafael Assunção first.
Yeah, he's like he's Bader-esque, you know?
Sure.
Like, if you can beat him, then you've got a good shot at beating the contender. So I think it's exactly the right fight to make for Moraes, because again, as we discussed, you don't have a lot of time to do an introductory thing with him where you give him a Ross Pearson equivalent. Like, you're gonna slot him in and see what he can do. I favor Moraes because of volume. I think that if Aljamain Sterling can kick the crap out of your legs and land a lot of kicking volume, then Moraes is going to have a field day with it. I think Moraes has the takedown defense to keep this standing if and when Assunção shoots, and I think that Moraes' footwork is good enough to keep himself out of real danger with Assunção's very slick counterpunching game. That's my read. I think this sounds to me like a competitive first round and then 2 clear rounds from Moraes, like a 30-27 decision.
Yeah, I mean, God help Moraes if he does get dragged to the ground with Assunção. I think he will actually be in trouble, like if Assunção gets on top of him on the grounds. But the low kicks, Assunção loves eating low kicks. Like, he doesn't love it, but he can't help it. You know what I mean? He's got a bad habit of getting kicked in the leg. And I remember when Pedro Munoz made his UFC debut on short notice and still kind of beat the shit out of Assunção's legs. And that's a bad habit to have against Marlon Moraes.
Yeah, I mean, like, Assunção made Munoz eat a lot of shots, but at that point, Munoz's defense was a double forearms guard. Like Moraes is not going to stand in front of you after he throws low kicks and let you punch him back.
Yeah. He's pretty crafty, man. I'm very excited to see him in the UFC. Like I at this point, I have essentially decided that I won't allow myself to get too hyped about any like regional or smaller promotions champion coming to the UFC, because I've been hurt too many times before. I've been hurt by Will Brooks. I've been hurt by I don't know, Hector Lombard. I've been hurt by everybody, but I am allowing myself to get a little hyped about Marlon Moraes because I think he is really good.
Yeah, I think he's going to surprise some folks because, like, I would expect if he wins this fight to see him in effectively a top contender matchup afterward.
Yeah, like I think maybe they might make, like, if Jimmy Rivera gets past Tomas Almeida, then I would enjoy seeing Rivera versus Moraes for a title shot, you know?
Or wouldn't you want to see Almeida versus Moraes?
Oh,
too,
yeah,
if
of course.
Wins that fight?
Yeah, of course. Or like, I kind of want to see Moraes fight anybody in the top 10 at bantamweight. So, and I think like it's tough for me to call those top fights, but my feeling on him is that he has the right style and is skillful enough that I would favor him over a lot of very good guys. Like I would favor Moraes over Caraway without much thought. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I can't even see that fight being. I could see that being competitive because Caraway is so tough.
Yeah,
but
tough and determined. But that's the thing. Like he's got the right style that I'm convinced he is at least a top 10 bantamweight, and I'm pretty sure he can hang with the best guys in the world. So
yeah, see, where with Gaethje, there's a real question. Like he may not actually be a top 10 lightweight.
Yeah.
Like he could get in there and lose 3 fights in a row in really convincing fashion,
yes.
And that would not be especially surprising.
Right.
Like I don't think that's going to happen, but you can see the scenario in which that happened. I have a hard time seeing a like Marlon Moraes losing to, you know, they cut Mitsugaki, right? But a Mitsugaki-esque bantamweight.
Don't remind me, Pat. You know, I love Takeya Mizugaki.
I know how you feel about Takeya Mitsugaki. It's a little embarrassing.
But, yeah, no, like, bantamweight is an extremely exciting division, and Marlon Moraes is a good part of why we say that. Like, he is one of those really interesting guys in the division.
So in this segment, did we want to talk real quick at the end here about Zabit Magomedsharipov?
Yeah, let's go ahead and cover that. Well, I'm going to let you take this one away to start with because you were the one who pointed him out to me as a new UFC prospect that needed attention. And you are right. He's very good, but you're the man with the passion for the man with the unpronounceable name. So tell me first.
Wait, yet another guy from the North Caucasus.
Yeah.
So he's 26. He's been fighting as a pro for just about 5 years now. So he's not super raw. Has not been especially active. He's 12-1, but he's fought real good competition in ACB. He was one of ACB's big prospect pickups, like right when they got started. So I've been following him as the ACB promotion has worked its way up. It's been kind of cool to watch them grow over the years. But he's beaten good guys. You know, his last fight was against journeyman extraordinaire Valdines Silva, and he just destroyed him. Absolutely beat the crap out of him. Magomedsharipov has finished all but 2 of his fights. Hasn't gone to a decision since 2013. There's basically nothing not to like about his game. He's another guy who's now training with Frankie Edgar and the crew over there.
Oh, is he? Jesus Christ!
Yeah, I think they brought him in to simulate Yair Rodriguez.
Makes sense, but again, he's already got a pretty sound understanding of how the boxing game works. It's scary to imagine what he could look like with a few years training with Mark Henry. We should also point out he's huge for a featherweight. He's 6'1". I don't think he may be now the tallest featherweight in the UFC featherweight division.
I think he's definitely up there.
Yeah, like it's like the only guy I could think of who would have ever been taller was Chris Cope, or what was his name? The guy who got cut. He fought Max Holloway.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. He is Will Chope.
Will Chope, that's it. Yeah, who was like that's the only guy I can think of who was a taller featherweight, and so it's a scary type of frame to have for a guy who seems poised, who is already a dangerous striker with killer ground and pound, and now seems to be in the right position to continue developing that game. So
yeah, he's a great tall guy fighter. He's a real slick kickboxer. He's got, like a lot of these North Caucasus guys, he comes from like a wushu sanda background, but he has clearly spent a lot of time boxing. Like, I don't know what his boxing background actually is, but he fights like a guy who has spent a lot of time working with boxing coaches. He moves that way. The way he throws his jab, especially, it's an educated jab.
Yeah, he's got a great jab.
Yeah, moves his head the way a boxer does too. Kind of loose, nice, loose, fluid hips, keeping his head moving off the center line. Not real marked, but definitely. But he's doing it and effective with the way that he does it.
Yeah, he's not like it's not a lot about his boxing is flashy, but a lot of the fundamentals are at least works in progress and very clearly things that he is working on. Like we last week, James Vick talked about how hard it is sometimes for tall guys to develop that defensive awareness. So far, it looks like Magomedsharipov has that. You know, he's not as easy to hit as a lot of guys with his height would be. His chin is not an available target. He pulls very readily. He gets his chin behind his shoulder. His footwork is quite good. He does a lot of, like, he still relies a bit, I think, on being really quick, a quick young guy, and kind of shuffling away out of range. But he will check your hands on the way in and pivot pretty nicely. And unlike a lot of tall guys who just want to get away, they want to get back to where they can start dictating, he will throw hard shots off of those pivots. He's not just thinking about getting out of range. He will actually hurt you on the way in if you chase him a little too eagerly. And then, of course, I think with that, whatever Sanda background or whatever it is that he has, he's got a really devastating kicking game as well. He has a devastating back kick, like a technically sound one and a very dangerous one that he has hurt numerous fighters with that I've seen.
Yeah, this is one of those things that we see a lot out of the Russian scene that is now starting to make its way into MMA as a whole, is not like a lot of wheel kicks, but just a real quick, real technically sound spinning back kick that's generally set up with other things.
Why do we see more wheel kicks than spinning back kicks anyway in MMA? The wheel kick it's always going to be easier to get away from. Right? You're throwing it to the head. It's more obvious because it's a wide arc. A quick spinning back kick or a mule kick, like that is a very dangerous technique.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And but like now I think we're starting to see it more. Like that's kind of what I draw from that, is that this is going to be a thing that we see, because it's when executed well, it's a pretty low risk technique. Like, I think a wheel kick is way riskier.
Well, we have another guy in the featherweight division who's been using it brilliantly for years now in Max Holloway. Mm-hmm. Max Holloway is kind of like a self-taught spinning back kick, because I don't think he really has that martial arts background. And back like before he even really had coaches, it was one of his favorite techniques. But I think it's because he like Magomedsharipov, is a tall, long guy who sees the utility in that technique. You're turning your back, but you are creating a very difficult obstacle for an opponent to run through. They have to have good lateral movement to get away from it, and they have to be very well drilled to get away from it. Like, they have to know you're going to throw it to stand a good chance of avoiding it. And it attacks the body, which, unlike the wheel kick, like, you can't come under it, you can't step through it as easily because it's linear. It's just a good technique, and it hurts like shit. Like, that may be the most painful technique possible, is to throw a spinning back kick to the liver. Honestly, yeah, it is devastating.
It hurts real bad. So I'm looking at Magomedsharipov Instagram page right now, and there's a picture of him at Nick Catone's gym, where he's in the ring boxing, and he has it #boxing, BOKSING. Love it. Like that. I absolutely love it. But I think so. They may have brought him in to work with Edgar for the Yair Rodriguez fight, but I actually think he's been there for a longer time than that. Yeah, maybe they just had him playing that role in camp.
It might just be Edgar's slightly unscrupulous connection with the Chechnyans that has that connection.
Well, he's definitely an Ali guy, for those of you who care about such things.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, since you mentioned him, not to destroy the mood for us, but our condolences to Nick Catone. You know, his son passed away.
I did hear that. That is just terrible.
I know.
Oh, my God. That is terrible to hear.
Yeah, Frankie Edgar dedicated that win over Yair Rodriguez to him, so I know there's not really anything we can do, but I think it's worth saying that, you know, Nick Catone's a good guy, and it's our condolences to him for that. But Zabit Magomedsharipov making his UFC debut hopefully pretty soon. Do we have any idea of who he might be fighting yet? It doesn't seem like we do.
We know that he signed the contract. I do not believe they've got him booked yet.
Yeah. What do you think like his ceiling is in the division? Do you have any early guesses for that?
Oh man, what's his ceiling? I mean, I think his ceiling is top 5.
Yeah.
Like he's young, he's real technically sound, he's crisp. He's got enough experience that you don't need to build him slow. You don't need to do the Yair Rodriguez build with him. Yeah. You could give him somebody. I think they give him a pretty straightforward first fight. You want to get a highlight. Out there for him, but after that, you can kind of push him to the top 20 for his second fight, and then maybe a top 15 guy for his third fight.
I mean, can you imagine like maybe 2 years down the line we get Magomedsharipov versus Holloway? I mean, it wouldn't fit on the poster. I think it's
entirely plausible.
It wouldn't fit on the poster, but it would be an amazing fight, right? Like that kind of matchup. I do think I have this weird belief that two tall, long guys in MMA almost always creates a very interesting fight. Like you usually get a really fascinating kickboxing match. And that was the case even when they're not necessarily on the same level. Like that was the case when Holloway fought Chope. Was the case when Tom Breeze fought Sean Strickland. Like you get two long, tall kickboxers to fight, and it's usually pretty interesting. So that fight right there, I don't know what it is, but Holloway Magomedsharipov just has. That is exactly what I want to see from him down the line, and I hope that he makes it to that level. And Max has time because Max is still so young that what is he like? Is he younger than Magomedsharipov actually? He is. I think
he actually is younger than Magomedsharipov. Yeah,
which is insane.
Magomedsharipov started fighting later, but Holloway, yeah,
still a little man, still a young boy, fighting Jose Aldo coming up soon. Oh my God. Okay, I can't talk about that because I'll get too nervous and excited about it. Do we want to talk about Peter Yan, or do we want to move on to our next segment?
We'll save Yan for a later point.
Okay.
We're actually going to be on a real busy schedule for the next while, but actually I'll say this about Yan because we probably won't have time. But he is a really, really, really talented young bantamweight. He's fighting out of Russia. He was an Alexander Shlemenko kind of protege, and now he spends a lot of time at Tiger Muay Thai, which is a really, really good up and coming camp in Thailand. This dude is really, really, really fucking good. If you haven't already, you look him up on YouTube. All his fights are there because he's fought in the ACB organization. You get a sense for what kind of guy he is. Similar, I think, in a lot of ways to Tom Duquesnoy in terms of the outlines of his game, except Yan is a little more defensively sound, a little crisper as a range striker, not the wrestler and grappler, but very similar in terms of their use of the clinch. Like I think that's a huge technical thing that's happening right now that we should probably spend a lot of time on at some point, maybe in a bonus episode. More and more stand-up fighters who are just overpowering in the clinch. Like Ioanni and Jacek is a good example. Duquesnoy is another one like this. But where they're using elbows and knees and they're framing and they're doing all sorts of stuff that has been common in Muay Thai but has not been in MMA for a while.
Yeah, and Yan has some really pretty like Thai-style foot sweeps as well. In the clinch. He's very crafty there. Also, one thing I like about Yan that is not a technical detail, but something I really like to see out of young fighters is that he has an insane amount of swagger. Like he is not afraid of like taunting an older, more experienced opponent in the cage. He's not afraid of like playing up how effective he's being. He's bold, man, and he puts his personality out there in his fights. So I like that about him. I think that kind of confidence is actually really, really valuable.
It's one of the things that I look for in a young fighter, frankly, like one with this level of talent. Like, does he fight like he's the fucking man?
Yeah, and he does. And he really does.
Yeah, that's because that's one of the things that separates elite fighters from guys who are just really good is, do you fight like your opponent should be scared of you? Do you do things to make them fear you? Do you impose your game? But also, do you carry yourself like a guy that people should be afraid of?
Yeah.
And that can go a long way. That went a long way for Junior Dos Santos and Anthony Pettis before people kind of figured them out. But that kind of nastiness and killer instinct and just sheer look at how fucking awesome I am. Like Jan fights like that. Tom Duquesnoy fights like that. Tomas Almeida fought like that when he was on the regionals. Justin Gaethje has always fought like that. Like, yeah, it's stuff that's worth bearing in mind as kind of intangibles when you're evaluating fighters.
Yeah, and it really stands out, especially like in really young fighters. Like when they have that kind of swagger, they don't have to build to it. It's a part of their personality. It does make a difference. It's like there's a boxer, I think he may be fighting this weekend, named Gervonta Davis, who has a similar bearing going on with him. He's like 23 years old, and he had his first big fight in his last outing, like some meaningless world title, but it was his first big step up, and it was just like he looked like he belonged there. And when you see those kinds of performances, like you see Jan fighting like Magomedov, like a solid fighter, and just beasting on him, and acting like he's beasting on him. It says a lot about how high his ceiling is. So we will look forward to Peter Yan if and when he does get signed by the UFC. But all three of those other guys have been signed, and we are extremely excited to see them make their first trip to the octagon. Let's take one more break, and when we come back, we are going to answer or discuss a segment topic proposed by one of our lovely patrons, Christopher Waters, who asked us to talk about defense in MMA. We will get to that after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. As promised, we are going to be covering a topic suggested by one of our patrons. If you want a topic discussed on the show for an entire segment of an episode, 15 to 20 minutes of discussion on the idea of your choice, then you can check us out on Patreon. $20 a month gets you access to that. Of course, we also do $5 a month for questions, $3 a month, lots of bonus episodes. Patreon is a place that you should go if you like Heavy Hands. Our question, or our topic this week, comes from Christopher Waters, who's been supporting us very generously on Patreon, and he wants to talk about defense in MMA. He says, do you agree that the quality of striking defense is worse in MMA compared to other striking sports? And if so, why? How will striking defense improve in the future? So I think this is a broad topic, but that's kind of the thing that we want for a segment like this. There's a lot that we can say about the state of defense in MMA, and we've already touched on this many, many times in the recent past, talking about, was it last episode I was griping about, or was that this episode when I was griping about the boxing footwork in MMA and why these guys don't seem to be receiving that instruction.
I think it was last week's episode.
Yeah, but we've talked about this a lot, sort of tangentially. This would be our opportunity to address it really directly. First of all, do you agree, Pat, that the quality of striking defense is worse in MMA compared to other sports?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of different aspects to that. The first is that boxing is the combat sport where striking defense is at its most highly developed. And as you discussed, we have not seen a ton of high-level boxing training in the UFC until pretty recently, I would say. Yeah. I think that's point number one. I'd say so. Point number two, it's connected to that, is that striking defense in Muay Thai and in Dutch-style kickboxing tends to be fairly limited. Not that there aren't great defensive fighters coming out of those traditions, but they're offensively focused combat sports. Mm-hmm. Like you look at the pace that guys fight at in under kickboxing rules in a glory fight or what have you. Look at the pace that guys keep in a Thai fight. Look at how they fight. Defense is just not the priority because it's not kind of anthropologically what those sports are aimed at. So there are things to draw from there. And when you're going to MMA, but if you come into MMA as one of these things, if you come into MMA with this kind of mindset, like you're going to be working from a defensive base that is not as that is not as developed to start with.
Yeah, I mean there are obviously things that boxers don't know how to defend, like kicks, for example, being a big one. But the thing that boxing brings to the table as a defensive art is that it has the most well-developed defensive tree or flow chart kind of approach, where there are a lot of trained reactions that are very systematic in boxers that you don't see so much in Muay Thai, where like betting has a big part to play in how that sport is scored. And so like in the last 20 years, we've seen a lot less footwork and evasion in Muay Thai and more like static blocks and like flashy dodges that are frequently not followed by offense because they're really put a lot of priority on looking like a badass after you defend something and not like backing down or being evasive, which they actually penalize. So like boxing is the sport where we see the best full contact striking sport, where we see the most fully developed defense, where by the way, there is just as like balance and offense are fetishized in Muay Thai, defense is fetishized in boxing.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good point.
You get a lot of, like, especially in American boxing, but I think in the sport as a whole, the tradition of boxing, if you read any text on the sweet science from, like, the early days of the sport sort of being regulated, it'll be like they had to, boxing people had to try and set their sport apart from the violent reputation that it had. People reacted to boxing then the way people react to MMA now. And still some react to boxing, but they're like, oh, it's violent, it's horrible, it's grotesque, it's barbaric, we should not be regulating this, we shouldn't be allowing it. And so they had to do what people who trained in martial arts in Europe had done for centuries, which is call it self-defense, or call it the art of defense, call it the sweet science, call it something more. And so it sort of, there was this pressure on boxing to be more like chess and less like fighting. And there was this sort of eloquent defense of the sport as it's not fighting, it's boxing. And what makes it boxing and not fighting is mostly defense. That's the thing that sets it apart. And so you get like judges and fans, they like to see defense in boxing, and that encourages people to be more defensive. And that encourages them to get better at being defensive. And you don't see that as much in MMA or other striking sports.
Yeah, that's true. There is not as much emphasis given to defense, aside from very rare fighters. Like I think Frankie Edgar has gotten a lot of credit for his defense. Even years ago when he didn't really deserve it, yeah, Edgar got a lot of credit for it. Dominic Cruz gets tons of credit for it.
Anderson Silva, like these guys, they're allowed to bullshit people even by not necessarily winning as clearly as it seems like they are because their defense is so good. And I will say, like, I don't mind that defense is not generally given a lot of credit on the scorecards in MMA because A, it's not part of the criteria where it is in boxing, but B, I don't think it should be. Like, I think defense should be its own reward, but it can't be, it can't be denied that the fact that defense is actively rewarded by judges in boxing probably has had an effect on the development of defense in that sport.
Unquestionably so. And in MMA, I'll give you an example of somebody for whom defense is its own reward, Jose Aldo. I think he's the best defensive fighter in MMA history by a pretty long stretch in terms of the layers of defense that he uses, the fundamental soundness of it, his ability to generate offense off of his defense. Like, I think he's exceptional at every aspect of that. But for Aldo, defense matters not because he's scoring points with it, but because it allows him to control the pace and fight his kind of fight. That's the reward for him. Not that he's like that a judge is like ticking off every time he slips a punch or what have you. It's because it's just like if you can't hit him, you can't force him to fight at a pace that he doesn't want to fight at or at a range he doesn't want to fight at. Yeah, I agree. And even like defense has that effect. Like when Cruz fought Dillashaw, on the people watching, they're like, oh, he's making him miss so badly. And I don't think that should be a factor in scoring. But if that is the effect of the defense in scoring, you're doing your job as a fighter, because part of your job is to, like, if you can, trick the judges into thinking that you're really, really winning this fight. But also, it has an effect on the opponent. Like, making someone miss is, again, its own reward. That doesn't have to be rewarded on the scorecards. If everyone watching is like, man, like Dillashaw can't land, imagine how frustrated Dillashaw himself must be when every single, like every fifth punch is landing and no more. It sucks to feel that. It makes you tired. It makes it more difficult to set your things up. And then when you follow up on that defense by countering
and by stinging the person, by punishing them for throwing all those combinations, it's its own reward. So I think there's enough incentive for defense to develop, and I think what MMA fighters need to do is probably just do a little more work with like good boxing trainers, like TJ Dillashaw has been doing, for example, training with Terrence Crawford's trainer, sparring with Vasyl Lomachenko, like expanding his skill set by training with what I think are objectively the best defensive strikers in the world. And I don't think there should be much debate about that.
Yeah, one of the things that this points to is just how much MMA still has to learn. And this has been a topic that we've discussed a bit today. We mentioned it in the last segment, talking about the Muay Thai game of Peter Yan and the clinch and kind of developments in that regard. MMA still has a ton to plumb from every other combat sport before it runs out of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and those are going to be some of the developments that we see. Is it's got like what we're seeing right now is more boxing style footwork in MMA. Finally, we're seeing more boxing style footwork. We might see better defense drawn from boxing as well. We're seeing better clinch work drawn from Muay Thai. We're seeing spinning back kicks and wheel kicks and things like that drawn from other martial arts. We're seeing better command of the distance and spacing that you might see that you might get from karate or what have you.
Yeah.
There's still a lot to plumb from wrestling too. Like the increasing use of top rides is yet another thing. Like there's still a lot. Point being that like I think MMA has gotten a lot from jiu-jitsu. I think there are still other things that it can pull from there, but jiu-jitsu is as close to being tapped as any martial art that we've seen. The others, there's still a lot to pull from.
Not that it is tapped, but if we're looking at the martial art where I think the most has been, MMA has gleaned the most from it, it's probably BJJ. And there are still other arts. And then after that, probably wrestling. But even there, like, there's still a lot that needs to be learned from wrestling. And we can see that, like somebody like Damian Maia, who was already a very solid mixed martial artist and was pretty much just a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu player, what was the evolution in his game? He worked on his striking. That was helpful, but he barely uses it anymore because the big development for Damian Maia was all wrestling. That was the thing that made him the fighter he is today, was learning to wrestle. And he wrestles like few other fighters do. Like, he really is one of the best chain wrestlers in the sport, especially for an old dude. Like, for a 38-year-old, he wrestles like a goddamn wizard. So I want to raise a certain point that often gets brought up, which is that MMA fighters have a harder time of developing defense because they have too much to worry about. And I think that is true. I think it's probably harder to develop any kind of consistent defensive tree or system when you have so much shit that could possibly be coming at you at any moment. Because, in boxing, you have two fists and you have a very limited target area that they are allowed to attack. And they can only attack as fists. So you have they're going to be a lot more specialized in throwing those hands, but like 30% of the different things that can be thrown at you by a boxer that you might see in MMA, where you might get a level change, which could be either a punch or a takedown. It could be a kick. You get kicks to every single target on the body except the groin. You get punches to every target on the body except the groin. You get a whole wide variety of different arcs and techniques. You get spins. And then you get into chain wrestling and the various ways that somebody can attack your legs or step into the clinch. And once they get to the clinch, are they going to hit you? What are they going to hit you with? Are they going to take you down? In what way are they going to do that? It's undeniable that there are a shitload of options for defense, things to worry about in MMA that don't exist in boxing. And so I think, you and I both agree, Pat, that defense, striking defense seems to be the last thing to develop in any strong way for most fighters. And I think that is true for basically every striking sport. I think the more experience you have, the more sparring you've done, the more drills you've done, like just time makes you more comfortable evading damage with strikes. But I think boxing still has a lot more like defensive specialists who are young, inexperienced fighters. They get better over time, but it's not like Floyd Mayweather had bad defense when he was a 16-year-old. He was Pretty Boy Floyd because he looked just as pretty after the sparring session as he did at the start, right? That was where he got the nickname from. He got better over time, but he was still good. And I don't think that happens in MMA specifically because of all of the options there are. I think it's a lot harder and takes a lot longer to develop what might be considered pretty fundamental defensive tools because of how much shit there is to worry about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that the time, just the sheer time that you have to work on it matters. I think that's a big thing. I think generally speaking, guys are not starting from the beginning of their career with elite boxing trainers. So Cody Garbrandt is kind of the exception to this rule, right? Because he's a young fighter who is really defensively sound. He moves his head well. He layers his defense. He's got good footwork. He's rarely in exactly that spot to get hit. Even though he's an offensively oriented fighter, I don't think he's not defensively deficient. No. Like, you wouldn't look at his game and be like, that dude doesn't know how to slip a punch, right?
No, he's quite a good boxer.
Exactly. So when you have guys who start from a young age with trainers who can teach those skills, as Garbrandt did, there's no difference to that. But it's still a matter of time, right? Like, if you're talking about a 22-year-old college wrestler who's fighting his first MMA fight, you know, guy graduates in May and has his first professional fight after 3 months of training in September or whatever. Like, that dude is probably not going to be a real slick defensive striking stylist. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of, when do you start?
Yeah.
How long have you been taught these things? Floyd Mayweather was Pretty Boy Floyd when he was 16 because he'd been boxing since he was 8.
Yeah.
Or younger,
and
like,
was
whatever.
In a family with phenomenal boxers. You know, like, yeah, the environment, the time, the amount of time he had, it mattered. And so I think what you get as a result of that, Pat, is that, like, in MMA, you get a lot of one-size-fits-all defensive reactions. You know, you get, like, in kickboxing, any kind of threat that you didn't expect. And again, it's harder to know what to expect when so much shit could be coming at you. It's like you throw up a high guard or you check. Like, you're just trying to do, like, something that will have the best chance of stopping anything that might be coming at you. And that's a lot easier to get around for somebody who has a well-schooled offense, because they know what you're going to do. You do it 3 times in a row, and then what's to stop them from throwing the perfect strike to get around that block the next time? When you see any kind of takedown, you know, it's like a sprawl. Like, it's a quick sprawl. That's the first thing you learn. When you're taken down, it's like you go full guard, or these days, like, you quickly learn to belly down, wall walk, and stand back up. Like, everything is, in MMA, I think there's a lot of pressure put on having the safest or the most efficient, consistent reaction right away. And that's because of how many options there are for what could be hitting you next. So I don't know what the solution to that is. I think that may always be a key difference between MMA and boxing. Like, I don't think it'll ever be as easy to learn to be a defensive fighter in MMA as it is in boxing. But certainly some of this has to do with just how striking defense is taught and prioritized in MMA. That I don't think there are a huge number of really good boxing coaches in the sport. And I think that is something that really could be improved pretty quickly if camps were to seek those guys out, or if those guys were willing to work with MMA fighters. Because I'm sure there are a lot of good boxing trainers out there who just, you know, they don't care about MMA. I think this may or may not be fair, but I think the derision towards MMA from boxing fans is generally more pronounced than the derision for boxing from MMA fans.
Yeah, I would say so.
You know, there's kind of a prejudice there, like all this rolling around on the ground and throwing kicks. It doesn't fit with this sort of manly ethic, I think, of boxing.
Yeah, could be. I mean, I think it's also just a matter of a lack of crossover. If you look at the places where MMA springs from, especially in the United States, not necessarily the same places that boxing springs from.
Yeah,
like, they are geographically distinct. They come from different kinds of communities with different kinds of bases. But
different, like, classes,
you know,
largely as well. You know, like, there's a clear economic divide between, like, who goes into MMA and who goes into boxing.
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, jiu-jitsu classes are $100 a month. I pay $25 a year to go to my boxing gym. So, like, the difference is pretty clear.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I don't disagree with any of that.
So, but, you know, like, some of it is just being willing to reach across the aisle. You know what I mean? Like, I know that Terrence Crawford's coach watches MMA sometimes. I remember somebody hit me up on Twitter and said that he was, like, really excited about Korean Zombie's knockout of Dennis Bermudez. You know, like, I know he watches it sometimes, but, like, is he going to reach out and be like, hey, can I coach an MMA fighter? No, it's up to Elevation and Dillashaw and his team to be like, hey, you know, we want to work with you. And if
I think we'll see it way more at an elite level. Like,
yeah, because you know, if you're gonna get paid, right? If you're gonna get paid well to teach somebody the fundamentals of boxing, like why? Who's really going to be that proud about the purity of boxing that they're not going to do that?
No, they'll take their whatever the cost is per session.
Right, as they should, right? Like it's good for the MMA fighters, it's good for them as long as. But again, it's also like MMA, the money isn't there as much as it is in boxing, so it's probably only at the elite level, and after a while, are you going to see those guys be able to afford to travel around and work with this variety of coaches necessary to improve their game in that way?
Yeah, that's true. So this is we've gone a long way off the topic of defense here, but
well, you know, there's not a lot to say without visual representation of like what does defense look like, but it's more I think about like the philosophy of why isn't it as good.
Well, yeah, and it's the greater context of the sport. Like there are a lot of reasons here that have very little to do with what actually happens inside a cage or a ring as to why defense in MMA looks the way it does. But I do think it's generally getting better. I think that there are more good defensive strikers at an elite level operating today than there were 5 years ago.
We don't
definitely way more than there were 10 years ago.
We don't really hear people saying that you can't slip or roll punches in MMA. You know what I mean? Like that used to be really common online in the MMA community. They're like, oh, you get kicked in the head, you can't slip. Nobody says that anymore, which is already a sign of improvement. It's like when Joe Rogan's watching a fight and he's like, wow, this is an educated crowd. They just cheered for a guard pass. We finally are getting closer to that level in MMA where people will watch head movement and be like, ooh, like that's good. It works. And I liked it. But we still have a ways to go. Like you and I both agree, the striking level in MMA is improving at a fascinating rate. And it has very recently, I think, started to come into its own, but it may never be up to par with boxing, but I think we both think it could be closer.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like, again, I really do think it comes back to just what sources are fighters drawing their knowledge from and to what degree and to what extent. And I think I never think it's a bad thing for fighters to go and work on one particular art for a while, to just go be real intense about it and learn a whole bunch of new things.
Look at Joe Duffy.
Joe Duffy is a great example of that. Tom Breeze too.
Yeah.
You know, Tom Breeze has spent a lot of time working on his jiu-jitsu and working on his boxing, like with specialist trainers. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. You know, you never want to lose the ability to do everything in some measure, but and I firmly believe this as kind of a general philosophical point on MMA in 2017. Like, you have got to be able to do something at an elite level. You cannot just be a jack of all trades in this sport. There has to be some skill set that you have that is capable of dominating a fight. Yeah, and you need to design and plan your game that way. To say, like, look, when all the chips are down, I want to be able to take anybody down. And I need to have the pieces of my game available to make that a possibility at least. I need to be able to strike with anybody, or I need to be able to grapple with anybody. And you've got it, or I need to be able to clinch with anybody. And like, you need to design your game and train yourself in such a way as to bring out that one skill set above all else. Yeah.
But maybe defense is the answer to, because I'm trying to think of how to say this, but I have an interesting point to make. Every single specific discipline has certain things endemic to it that MMA fans will say, like, oh, you can't do that in MMA. And I think that is like, that negative approach is wrong. I think it is generally wrong. I think the solution to, because basically what they're saying is, like, for defense, you need to limit your game. And that's not how defense works, right? Defense should allow your game to flourish. So I think where well-roundedness comes into it, where exploring other disciplines is like, people will be like, oh, again, I said that they don't say this as much anymore, but they'll be like, oh, you can't stand in a boxing stance, whatever that is. You'll get taken down. And I'm like, well, the solution is not to stop boxing. The solution is to learn to wrestle. You know, like, that wrestling can fit into your boxing game, and that you learn how to respond. So like Jose Aldo looks like an amazing boxer, knows how to wrestle, so he gets to box like an amazing boxer. So yeah, I think that being willing to explore other arts and expand is a great thing, and it should encourage your specialization, like the thing that you're good at, rather than you limiting your specialty because it's not perfectly suited to MMA already. There are no limits on what kind of style can work in MMA. If you are trained well enough, if you're athletic enough, whatever. Like, there are no limits. That is kind of the beauty of the sport. And while that makes learning defense harder, it also means that your options are much, much more. So I think that's about it for us. Christopher, thank you so much for that topic. I hope you don't feel like that went off the rails. I thought it went in a pretty interesting direction. And it's an interesting one to discuss. And we are, of course, always going to be pointing out the next levels of defensive development, especially striking defense in MMA. So thank you again for your topic suggestion. Thank you very much for your contribution to the show. We really do appreciate it. And thank you everybody else who has supported Heavy Hands on Patreon. We've picked up a lot of new pledges lately, and we appreciate every single one of them. We hope you guys are enjoying that bonus content. And if you are not already one of our $3 or higher subscribers on Patreon, you should jump on that bandwagon. We've got a new series going with me and Phil McKenzie called The Underdogs. We're kind of talking about unsung heroes, journeymen, weirdos, and we're going to approach that topic from all kinds of different angles. You can listen to the first episode of that for free as part of the regular Heavy Hands RSS feed, but future episodes are all going to be for $3 patrons or up. Pat and I do 2 or more bonus episodes every single month. Our next one is going to be a discussion of this weekend's upcoming fight between Alexander Gustafsson and Glover Teixeira, as well as a couple other fights from that card that pique our interest. I'm sure, Pat, that we will talk about Mairbek Taisumov at the very least. And so you want to hear that? That's for $3 patrons. And otherwise, we do appreciate your guys' help. We appreciate you listening. And get at us on social media, at BoxingBush, BUSCH. That's me. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman. Pat, this may be a dangerous question to ask, but do you know what you have coming out this week yet?
Nothing MMA related, but a new Fall of Rome on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain.
Okay, cool. Very cool. How many more are you doing of Fall of Rome before you move on to the next era?
I'm going to keep doing, so I guess I might as well lay this out there. So what I'm looking at doing is expanding the show, and I'm going to call it something different. I'm not going to say what the title is yet, though I have one in mind. But basically, I'll be doing 1 month of Fall of Rome and 1 month of The Rise of the Modern World, which is the second series that I'll be doing, with interviews and other little things interspersed.
Not to sound impatient, I am looking forward to your take on the early modern era. I think we both have an interest in that. Yeah. So if you guys aren't listening to the Fall of Rome and Pat's other podcasts already, I mean, you're probably in the minority because those shows are much more popular than this one, but you really should. It is worth your time to hear somebody who is good at explaining technical details, as you know from Heavy Hands, explaining very fascinating era of history to you.
Well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely, man. And I'm out of town this week, so I'm not sure that I'll have anything coming out aside from a Sherdog preview for all of UFC Stockholm, but that was done ahead of time. Spoilers. Thank you guys for tuning in. We appreciate you, and we will see you next time. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you know you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.